Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had been stationed at Naval Base Coronado for exactly 21 days, and she was already tired of the stairs. Every time she walked through the corridors of the sprawling California installation, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned with mechanical precision. Whispers followed in her wake like the turbulence behind a ship cutting through calm water. The morning Pacific breeze carried the salt scent of the ocean across the base as Sarah made her way from the administrative building toward her quarters. She had just finished a briefing with the operations officer, reviewing training schedules and equipment assignments that would define her next few weeks at Coronado. The meeting had gone well enough professional and businesslike, but she had noticed the way the staff sergeant's eyes lingered on her uniform, searching for some explanation of why she was there. The problem wasn't that she was new to the base. Naval installations saw fresh faces constantly, a continuous rotation of personnel, moving through training programs, deployment cycles, and permanent changes of station. Officers, enlisted personnel, and civilian contractors flowed through Coronado like tide through the harbor, each bringing their own specialties and assignments. The problem was that Sarah Mitchell was a woman, and more specifically a woman who had somehow ended up wearing the uniform of what most people considered the most exclusive brotherhood in the American military. She kept her shoulders straight and her expression neutral as she navigated the maze of concrete buildings and palm-lined walkways that made up the heart of the base. The California sun beat down with the intensity of late afternoon, creating sharp shadows that provided brief respites from the heat. Sarah had learned early in her military career that showing any sign of discomfort or uncertainty was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. The military respected strength above all else, and weakness was an invitation for predators. Her daily routine at Coronado had settled into a familiar pattern over the past 3 weeks. Morning physical training with whatever unit happened to be cycling through their conditioning programs. Briefings with various department heads who were still trying to figure out exactly what to do with her. Equipment familiarization sessions in preparation for training exercises that remained deliberately vague in their official descriptions. And always, everywhere she went, the stairs. Some were curious, the natural human response to seeing something unexpected. Others carried suspicion, doubt, or outright hostility. A few showed what might have been respect, though those were rare enough that Sarah had begun to notice each one individually. The afternoon briefing had covered upcoming training scenarios designed to test small unit tactics and crisis response procedures. Sarah would be integrated into various teams over the coming weeks, her performance evaluated not just on technical competence but on her ability to function effectively within the complex social dynamics of military units that had never included someone like her. As she approached the mess hall for dinner, Sarah reflected on the strange position she found herself occupying. 6 months ago, she had been focused entirely on surviving the most demanding military training program in the world, concentrated on proving to herself and her instructors that she could meet every standard, complete every challenge, and earn her place through pure determination and skill. Now she was discovering that earning her place had been only the beginning. The real challenge was maintaining it day after day in an environment where her presence challenged assumptions that had gone unquestioned for generations. The mess hall at Naval Base Coronado was a utilitarian structure that prioritized function over aesthetics. Long rows of tables filled a space designed to feed hundreds of personnel efficiently during peak mealtimes. The walls were painted institutional beige, broken up by windows that looked out over the training facilities where the next generation of naval warriors honed their skills. Sarah grabbed a standard issue tray and moved through the serving line, selecting grilled chicken rice, steamed vegetables, and a piece of cornbread that looked slightly better than the usual military standard. The food service personnel treated her with the same efficient politeness they showed everyone else, though she noticed one of the cooks, a woman in her 40s with graying hair, give her a small nod that might have been acknowledgement or encouragement. The mess hall was about half full, mostly enlisted personnel finishing their dinner shifts before evening training or administrative duties. The familiar sounds of military dining filled the air, metal utensils scraping against plastic trays, muffled conversations about training schedules and weekend liberty plans, the occasional burst of laughter from tables where someone had shared a particularly entertaining story about the day's mishaps. Sarah found an empty table near the back wall, choosing a position that put her back to most of the room. She had discovered that not seeing the stairs made them slightly more tolerable, though she could still feel the weight of curious eyes like heat from a distant fire. She opened a technical manual on advanced small unit tactics that she had brought along, using it as both professional development and a barrier between herself and the ambient attention. For exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds, she was able to eat in something approaching peaceful silence. Well, 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 what do we have here? The voice came from directly behind her, deep and mocking, carrying the kind of theatrical confidence that young men often developed when they had an audience and wanted to prove something. Sarah didn't turn around immediately. She had encountered this scenario before in training facilities from Virginia to California, and experience had taught her that the best initial strategy was usually to avoid engagement. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart." Now there were footsteps, 3 distinct sets moving with deliberate purpose around to face her table. The conversations at nearby tables had begun to quiet as other diners sensed developing drama. Sarah finally looked up from her manual to see 3 young men in navy fatigues, their uniforms so crisp and spotless that they practically announced their recent graduation from boot camp. The one in the middle was clearly their leader, tall and blond with ice blue eyes, and the kind of confident bearing that had suggested he had never encountered a problem that daddy's money or connections couldn't solve. His name tape read Morrison in block letters that looked fresh from the supply room. He stood with his hands on his hips, head tilted slightly, wearing the expression of someone who believed he was about to be very clever. To his right stood Thompson, shorter and more powerfully built, with dark hair cut in a severe military style and suspicious eyes that kept darting around the mess hall to catalog who was watching their performance. His posture suggested he was ready for physical confrontation and possibly eager for it. The third member of their group, Palmer, hung back slightly. Red-haired and freckled, with the kind of thin frame that spoke of late growth spurts and insufficient time in the weight room, he looked distinctly uncomfortable with whatever was about to unfold. His eyes kept shifting between his companions and the exit, as if calculating whether he could extract himself from the situation before it escalated beyond his comfort level. "You lost honey?" Morrison asked, his voice pitched to carry to the surrounding tables. "This is the Navy mess hall, not the civilian cafeteria. Pretty sure you took a wrong turn somewhere between the base gift shop and the tourist parking lot." Thompson snickered appreciatively, stepping closer to the table. "Maybe she's looking for the Dependents Club. That's usually where the wives hang out while their husbands do the real work." Palmer shifted his weight nervously, but didn't contribute to the verbal assault. Sarah noted his discomfort with professional interest while maintaining her calm exterior expression. Sarah set down her fork with deliberate precision and looked up at the 3 young men with steady, unblinking eyes. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, sailors." Morrison's grin widened into something that wasn't entirely pleasant. "Sailors, that's cute. You hear that, boys? The little lady thinks we're equals." He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on her table with enough force to make her tray jump slightly. "See, here's the thing about military installations. This is where real warriors train for real combat, not some feel-good publicity stunt designed to make the Navy look progressive on CNN. Around the mess hall, conversations had begun to die out completely. Heads were turning toward their table with the inevitable human fascination with conflict. Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes, some curious, some uncomfortable, and more than a few clearly hoping for entertainment to break up another routine evening meal. "I earned my place here," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of steady authority that came from absolute certainty. "Same as everyone else." Thompson laughed harshly, the sound cutting through the increasingly quiet mess hall like a blade. "Earned it right. I'm sure those physical standards were real challenging after they got adjusted for your limitations." He crossed his arms and looked her up and down with obvious disdain. "What did you do to get here? Sleep with the right commanding officer, flash the right smile at the review board?" Palmer finally found his voice, though it came out weaker than he probably intended. "Maybe she's lost. This isn't the secretarial pool princess. Shouldn't you be somewhere taking dictation, filing reports?" The mess hall had gone almost completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their constant clattering to listen to the confrontation unfolding in their dining room. Sarah could feel her pulse beginning to quicken, not from fear or anger, but from a familiar physiological response she recognized from countless training scenarios and real-world operations. It was the same feeling she experienced before every mission, time seeming to slow, slightly sensory input becoming more acute, her body preparing for action with the automatic efficiency of a finely tuned machine. Every detail of her environment became crystal clear. The exact distance between herself and each potential threat. The positioning of furniture that could provide cover or concealment. The locations of exits and potential weapons. Morrison seemed to interpret her silence as intimidation or submission. He leaned even closer, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper, but which carried clearly in the silent room. Here's some free advice, sweetheart. This isn't a game we're playing here. Real soldiers could get killed in combat because the Navy decided to play politics with their diversity quotas. So why don't you do everyone a favor and request a transfer to somewhere more appropriate for your skill set? Maybe the Coast Guard. I hear they're more accommodating to people who can't handle the real military. Sarah slowly closed her technical manual and placed it beside her tray with movements that were precisely controlled and utterly calm. She stood up, rising to her full height, and took a moment to assess the three men facing her with the kind of professional evaluation that had become second nature during her military training. Morrison was approximately 6 feet 2 inches tall, probably weighing around 190 pounds based on his build and visible muscle definition. Athletic but not exceptionally so, his stance suggested someone who had probably played sports in high school but hadn't maintained serious physical conditioning since then. Thompson was shorter at maybe 5'8", but more heavily muscled, probably closer to 170 pounds of what looked like functional strength rather than gymnasium vanity muscle. His positioning and the way he held his hands suggested some familiarity with physical confrontation. Palmer was clearly the weak link in their group, tall but reed thin, probably 160 pounds at most, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was already regretting his decision to participate in whatever this was supposed to accomplish. "You finished with your little speech?" Sarah asked quietly. Morrison straightened up, apparently pleased that he had provoked some kind of response. "Oh, now she's getting tough. What are you going to do about it? File a harassment complaint, run crying to your commanding officer about the mean boys who hurt your feelings." Sarah looked around the mess hall, taking note of the faces watching their confrontation. Every eye in the room was focused on their table now. She could see a mixture of expressions: curiosity, discomfort, anticipation, and in a few cases what might have been concern for where this was heading. In the far corner of the room, she spotted several senior enlisted personnel who had stopped eating to observe the developing situation. Their faces showed the kind of professional interest that suggested they understood they were witnessing something that could have consequences far beyond a simple disagreement over dinner. "Actually," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent room, "I was thinking something more direct, more educational." The change in her tone made Morrison's confident grin falter slightly. There was something different about the way she was standing now, something that hadn't been there when she was sitting quietly at her table, trying to eat dinner and read her manual in peace. Her posture had shifted subtly, becoming more balanced, more centered. Her weight was distributed evenly on both feet, her hands hanging loose and ready at her sides. To most observers, the changes would have been nearly invisible, but to anyone with combat training, her stance now screamed readiness for immediate action. "You threatening me?" Morrison asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier swagger. "Because I should remind you that assaulting a fellow service member is a serious court-martial offense, not exactly the kind of thing that's going to help your career prospects." Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation had begun. It wasn't a particularly warm expression. "Who said anything about assault? I was thinking more along the lines of a demonstration, an educational opportunity." Thompson stepped forward, apparently thinking his friend needed backup or perhaps simply eager to escalate the situation to physical confrontation. "Demonstration of what?" "How to get yourself kicked out of the Navy in record time." "Demonstration of why you should be very careful about making assumptions." Sarah replied, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You see, boys, you made a critical error in your intelligence gathering process. You assumed you knew who I was and what I was capable of based on nothing more than my gender and your own preconceptions. That's the kind of mistake that gets people killed in the real world." Morrison was starting to look uncertain, but he had committed himself too far to back down, now especially with half the mess hall watching and waiting to see how this would resolve. Whatever you think you're going to prove here, sweetheart, I'd think twice about it. Simple math says we outnumber you 3-1. Not exactly favorable odds for making your point. 3-1, Sarah repeated thoughtfully as if she was seriously considering the mathematical implications. You're absolutely right about the numbers, but you're completely wrong about everything else that matters. She paused, letting her gaze move slowly from face to face. You want to know what I am? What gives me the right to be here? What makes me qualified to wear this uniform? The mess hall was so quiet now that the only audible sounds were the distant hum of kitchen equipment and the barely perceptible breathing of the watching crowd. Even Thompson and Palmer seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic of their confrontation, though they couldn't quite identify what had changed. Sarah reached up slowly and touched a small pin on her collar that the three young men had failed to notice in their eagerness to prove whatever point they thought they were making. It was a small, unremarkable piece of metal that meant absolutely nothing to most people who saw it, but to those who knew what to look for, it told a very specific and significant story. This is a seal trident, she said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent mess hall. I am Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy SEALs, and you three just made the biggest mistake of your military careers. The silence that followed her announcement was so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Morrison's face went through several distinct color changes, settling on a pale shade that made his freckles stand out like scattered paint drops. Thompson took an involuntary step backward, his confident posture deflating like a punctured balloon. Palmer looked like he was actively considering whether he could reach the exit before anyone noticed him leaving. But Sarah wasn't finished with her lesson. She had spent the better part of 2 years proving herself in the most demanding military training program the United States had ever devised. She had endured Hell Week when 90% of her fellow candidates had rung the bell and quit. She had completed underwater demolition training that had broken seasoned warriors half again her size. She had mastered advanced combat tactics, survival techniques, and weapon systems that most military personnel would never even see, let alone qualify to operate. She had earned her place in the most elite fighting force in the world through blood, sweat, determination, and a level of physical and mental toughness that these three recruits couldn't begin to comprehend. And now in front of dozens of witnesses, her qualifications and right to be there had been questioned by young men who probably hadn't even finished their basic military training. It was time for that educational demonstration she had mentioned. Morrison was the first to recover his voice, though it came out considerably smaller than before. SEAL, that's impossible. There are no women in the SEALs. Everyone knows that. Sarah's smile remained steady, but now it carried an edge that made several observers in the mess hall shift uncomfortably in their seats. Really, are you absolutely certain about that? Because I'm standing right here wearing this uniform and this pin on my collar tells a different story. She gestured slightly toward the trident insignia. But I understand your confusion. The Navy doesn't exactly advertise when barriers get broken, especially when those barriers have been in place since the teams were founded. Thompson, still looking shaken but apparently unwilling to completely surrender his position, made what would prove to be his second major mistake of the evening. Even if that's somehow true, it doesn't change the fundamental reality here. You still don't belong here with real combat troops who've actually seen action. The words were barely out of his mouth when Sarah moved. To most of the observers in the mess hall, what happened next probably looked like she simply took a quick step forward and slightly to the right. But suddenly Thompson was on the ground, his arm twisted behind his back in a position that was obviously uncomfortable, but carefully controlled to avoid permanent damage. 4 seconds, Sarah said conversationally, as if she wasn't currently restraining a grown man who outweighed her by 30 pounds with seemingly minimal effort. That's exactly how long it took. Morrison lunged forward, apparently thinking he could help his friend, or at least prove his own courage to the watching crowd. He was bigger than Sarah by a considerable margin, and had probably assumed throughout his life that size would give him decisive advantages in any physical confrontation. He discovered very quickly that his assumptions were dangerously incorrect. Sarah released Thompson and pivoted smoothly to her left, using Morrison's own momentum against him, with the kind of fluid precision that spoke of thousands of hours of training. Her hand found his wrist, applied pressure at exactly the right angle, and suddenly the larger man was airborne. He hit the floor hard, the wind driven from his lungs, staring up at the ceiling with the confused expression of someone who wasn't entirely sure what had just happened or how he had gotten there. Palmer, the red-headed recruit who had wisely remained on the periphery of the confrontation, was now backing away rapidly with his hands raised in what might have been surrender or simply an attempt to distance himself from whatever was happening to his companions. Sarah looked at him for a moment, then nodded with something that might have been approval. "Smart choice," she said. "Always recognize when you're outmatched. It's a survival skill that will serve you well if you decide to make a real career out of this." Thompson was struggling to get back to his feet, his face flushed red with embarrassment and what was probably a fair amount of genuine anger. "This is assault," he said, his voice cracking slightly with stress and humiliation. "You can't just attack fellow service members because they hurt your feelings." Sarah looked around the mess hall at the dozens of watching faces all focused on their table with the kind of intense attention usually reserved for natural disasters or traffic accidents. "Attack?" she asked, raising one eyebrow. "Does anyone here see evidence of an attack?" There was a murmur of negative responses from the crowd, along with some barely suppressed chuckles from observers who had clearly enjoyed the sudden reversal of fortune. What they had witnessed hadn't looked like violence so much as a practical demonstration of applied physics, with Sarah serving as an immutable force of nature. "What I see," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly throughout the silent room, "is three recruits who challenged a superior officer's qualifications and received a practical demonstration in combat techniques. Educational purposes only, of course. I'm sure the training value was considerable." Morrison had finally managed to get his breathing back under control and was sitting up on the floor looking around as if trying to figure out exactly where he was and how he had gotten there so quickly. "This isn't over," he said, though his voice carried no conviction whatsoever. Sarah walked back to her table and sat down, picking up her fork as if the previous few minutes had been nothing more than a minor interruption to her dinner routine. "You're absolutely right about one thing," she said calmly, taking a bite of chicken that had gone cold during the confrontation. "It's not over. It's never over. Every single day I have to prove that I belong here, that I earn my place, that I'm worthy of wearing this uniform and carrying out the missions this country assigns to me." She paused to take a sip of water, letting her words settle over the silent mess hall. "Today you gentlemen gave me another opportunity to do exactly that. I should probably thank you for the chance to demonstrate why assumptions based on appearance can be so dangerous in our line of work." The three recruits slowly gathered themselves together and began moving toward the exit, their earlier swagger completely deflated and replaced by the kind of careful movements that suggested they were still processing what had just happened to them. Thompson nursed his arm. Morrison moved gingerly as if checking for broken ribs, and Palmer looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. As they reached the door, Sarah called out one final time, her voice carrying clearly across the mess hall. "Oh, and gentlemen, next time you want to challenge someone's qualifications or right to be somewhere, you might want to do your homework first. A simple Google search could have saved you considerable embarrassment this evening." As the mess hall began to return to something approaching normal conversations, resuming in cautious whispers, utensils beginning to clatter again, the usual sounds of military dining. Slowly returning, Sarah continued eating her meal in what was now genuine peaceful silence. She had made her point clearly and decisively. She had demonstrated her capabilities in a way that would be remembered and discussed for weeks to come. Most importantly, she had established that questioning her presence at Coronado would come with consequences that most people would prefer to avoid. But even as she finished her dinner, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve and abilities, new people who would need to be convinced that she had earned her place in the most elite fighting force in the world. That was simply the reality of being a pioneer in a field that had never welcomed people like her. The important thing was that she was ready for whatever came next, just as she had been ready for the three recruits who had cornered her in the mess hall this evening. Her training had prepared her for combat operations in the most hostile environments on Earth, but it had also given her something equally valuable, the unshakable confidence that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of accomplishing when the situation demanded it. Word of the mess hall incident began spreading through Naval Base Coronado before Sarah had even finished her cold dinner. By the time she returned to her quarters that evening, She could already sense subtle changes in the way people looked at her as she walked through the corridors. The next morning brought a summons to the office of Captain James Hayes, the base commanding officer. Sarah had met Hayes briefly during her initial check-in 3 weeks earlier, but this would be their first substantive conversation since her arrival at Coronado. Captain Hayes was a career naval officer in his late 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent on ships and in command positions around the world. His office walls were decorated with commendations, unit citations, and photographs from various deployments that traced the arc of a successful military career. Lieutenant Mitchell, Hayes said as she entered his office and came to attention before his desk. I understand there was some excitement in the mess hall last evening. Yes, sir. 3 recruits questioned my qualifications and presence on this base. I provided a practical demonstration of why their assumptions were incorrect. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying her face with the kind of professional assessment that senior officers develop through years of evaluating subordinates in situations. From what I've been told by multiple witnesses, it was quite an educational experience. No formal complaints have been filed, and everyone I've spoken with describes it as a controlled demonstration rather than an unprovoked assault. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. Still, I have to ask, was there no way to handle the situation without resorting to physical confrontation? These incidents have a way of generating paperwork and attracting attention from people who don't always understand the context. Sarah maintained her position of attention while considering how to respond. Sir, in my experience, some lessons can only be learned through direct hands-on experience. Those 3 recruits learned more about combat capabilities and the dangers of making assumptions in 45 seconds than they would have absorbed from a semester of classroom instruction on the subject. Hayes nodded slowly. I suppose that's one way to look at it. And I have to admit the feedback I'm getting suggests that your approach was quite effective in getting your point across. His expression grew more serious. Just remember, Lieutenant, that every action you take here reflects not only on yourself, but on the future of women in special operations roles. The spotlight on you is considerably brighter than what most officers have to deal with. As Sarah left the captain's office and made her way across the base toward her next appointment, she reflected on Hayes's words about the spotlight. He was absolutely right about the scrutiny, though she was beginning to understand that attention wasn't necessarily a bad thing if it was the right kind of attention. That evening, as she was finishing her workout in the base fitness center, Sarah was approached by a figure she recognized by reputation, but had never formally met. Master Chief Bill Davidson was something of a legend at Coronado, a man whose career had spanned the final decades of the Cold War and whose knowledge of naval operations was considered encyclopedic by those who had served with him. At 58, Davidson still maintained the kind of physical conditioning that put men half his age to shame. His steel gray hair was cut in a precise military style, and his pale blue eyes carried the kind of calm authority that came from 3 decades of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. Lieutenant, he said as Sarah finished her final set of pull-ups and dropped down to face him. Even exhausted from her workout, she automatically came to attention in the presence of such a senior enlisted man. Master Chief, Sarah replied, maintaining proper military courtesy despite her fatigue. Davidson studied her for a moment with those pale eyes taking in details that most people would have missed. Heard about your educational session in the mess hall yesterday. Word is you made quite an impression on some young sailors who needed their perspectives adjusted. Just a practical demonstration, Master Chief. Nothing more than that. Nothing more than that, Davidson repeated, a slight smile creasing the corners of his eyes. You know, Lieutenant, I've been in this Navy for 30 years now. Served through the end of the Cold War, watched this service adapt to changes that would have been unthinkable when I first put on the uniform. He paused, seeming to choose his words with care. What I witnessed yesterday evening wasn't about politics or progress or any of the other buzzwords people like to throw around. What I saw was a warrior proving their worth through action rather than rhetoric. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with her recent physical exertion. Recognition from someone of Master Chief Davidson's stature and experience meant more than a dozen official commendations from people who had never seen combat. Thank you, Master Chief. That means more than you probably realize. Davidson nodded once sharply. Just remember something, Lieutenant. Proving yourself once is never enough in this business. There's always another test waiting, another group of people who think they know better, another challenge that's going to require you to demonstrate your capabilities all over again. His expression grew serious. The key is being ready for all of them every single time. From what I observed yesterday, you understand that better than most. As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. Master Chief, can I ask you something? He paused, looking back with raised eyebrows. How did you handle it when you were coming up through the ranks, the resistance, I mean? The people who thought they knew what you were capable of before you had a chance to prove it. Davidson was quiet for a long moment, his gaze growing distant as if he were looking back through decades of memory and experience. Same way you handled it last night, Lieutenant, he said finally. By being so damn good at my job that anyone who questioned my capabilities looked like a fool for doing it. He smiled slightly. Only difference is my challenges were about submarine operations and sonar systems. Yours are about breaking down barriers that have been in place since this Navy was founded. Higher stakes, same fundamental principle. That night, as Sarah lay in her rack reviewing the events of the past few days, she found herself thinking about the strange trajectory her military career had taken. Just a few months ago, she had been focused entirely on surviving SEAL training, concentrated on proving to herself and her instructors that she could meet every standard and complete every challenge thrown her way. Now she was discovering that graduation from training had been only the beginning of a much larger and more complex mission. She wasn't just a naval officer anymore. She was a symbol, a test case, a representative of possibilities that had never existed before in the history of American special operations. The three recruits in the mess hall had given her an opportunity to demonstrate that she was worthy of the trust and responsibility that came with that role. But she also knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new people who would need to be convinced that the barriers they had always accepted as permanent could actually be broken down through competence and determination. The important thing was that she was ready for whatever came next, armed with the training confidence and unshakable sense of purpose that had carried her through every challenge so far. And if someone else wanted to question her right to be there, well, she had proven she was more than capable of providing the kind of educational experience they would never forget. As sleep finally took her, Sarah's last conscious thought was simple and clear. Let them come. She had work to do. 3 weeks had passed since the mess hall incident, and Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was beginning to understand that her demonstration of combat skills had solved one problem while creating several others. The stairs that followed her through the corridors of Naval Base Coronado had changed in quality. Where once they had carried dismissal or skepticism, now they held a mixture of respect, curiosity, and in some cases carefully concealed resentment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training facilities as Sarah made her way to her first briefing of the day. She had established a routine that began before dawn with a 5-mile run along the beach, followed by strength training in the base gym, then a series of meetings and training sessions that filled her schedule until evening. The physical activity helped channel the restless energy that came from being constantly observed and evaluated, while the professional obligations reminded her why she was at Coronado in the first place. But lately, those professional obligations had become increasingly complicated. It had started small, the kind of minor inconveniences that could easily be attributed to the normal chaos of military logistics. Equipment requests that took twice as long to process as they should have. Training schedules that somehow developed discrepancies between what she had been told and what actually appeared on official rosters. Supply requisitions that disappeared into administrative black holes, requiring multiple follow-up calls and visits to track down basic items she needed for upcoming exercises. At first, Sarah had chalked these problems up to the inevitable friction that occurred when any new person was integrated into an established system. Military bureaucracy was famous for its inefficiency, and she had experienced similar frustrations during her training and previous assignments. But as the incidents accumulated, she began to recognize patterns that suggested something more deliberate than simple administrative incompetence. The first clear sign that she was dealing with intentional sabotage came during a weapons familiarization exercise the previous Tuesday. Sarah had signed out an M4 carbine for a marksmanship session, following all proper procedures and presenting the required documentation to the armory staff. The weapon had looked perfect when she received it freshly cleaned and properly maintained according to military standards. 20 minutes into her range time, the rifle had suffered a catastrophic malfunction that could have resulted in serious injury if she hadn't recognized the warning signs and ceased fire immediately. The subsequent investigation revealed that someone had deliberately tampered with the weapon's gas system, creating a condition that would cause dangerous overpressure in the chamber. The armory chief, a grizzled master sergeant with 25 years of experience, had been visibly shaken when he examined the rifle. "I've never seen anything like this, Lieutenant," he had said, his voice tight with anger and concern. "This wasn't accidental wear or manufacturing defect. Someone deliberately sabotaged this weapon with the specific intent of causing it to fail dangerously." The incident had been reported up the chain of command and was supposedly under investigation, but Sarah had heard nothing further about it in the 10 days since it occurred. Meanwhile, she had begun conducting her own informal investigation, paying closer attention to patterns in the problems she was experiencing. What she had discovered was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. The sabotage wasn't random or opportunistic. It was systematic, coordinated, and clearly being carried out by people with access to secure facilities and detailed knowledge of her schedule and activities. Someone was conducting a deliberate campaign to undermine her training, damage her equipment, and create situations that could result in her failure or injury. The mess hall incident had apparently convinced certain people that subtle discrimination wasn't sufficient to address what they saw as the problem of her presence at Coronado. Sarah finished her morning run and headed to the shower facilities, her mind working through the tactical implications of what she was facing. In combat, you always had to consider not just the enemy you could see, but the threats that remained hidden. Someone was treating her assignment to Coronado as a battlefield, which meant she needed to respond with the same level of strategic thinking she would apply to any hostile environment. The hot water felt good against muscles that had been pushed hard during her workout, but Sarah's mind remained focused on the challenges ahead. She had earned her place through demonstrated competence, but apparently that wasn't enough for everyone who had a stake in maintaining the status quo. As she dried off and put on her uniform, Sarah reflected on a conversation she had overheard the previous day while walking past a group of senior enlisted personnel. They hadn't noticed her approach, and their words had revealed more about the underlying dynamics at Coronado than any official briefing she had received. "It's not about her personally," one of them had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "She might be competent, might even be exceptional, but this whole integration thing is happening too fast without proper consideration of the consequences. The teams have worked a certain way for decades," another voice had added. "You start changing fundamental assumptions about personnel and capabilities, and people are going to get killed. It's not about prejudice. It's about proven systems that work under extreme stress." Sarah had continued walking without acknowledging what she had heard, but the conversation had crystallized something she had been thinking about for weeks. The resistance she was facing wasn't entirely personal. Some of it came from people who genuinely believed that her presence represented a dangerous experiment with systems that had proven themselves through years of successful operations. That didn't make the sabotage any more acceptable, but it helped explain why it was happening and why it was likely to escalate rather than diminish over time. The morning briefing was held in a sterile conference room that could have been found on any military installation in the world. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, a long table, surrounded by utilitarian chairs that had seen better days. The attendees were a mix of officers and senior enlisted personnel responsible for coordinating training activities across the base. Captain Hayes presided over the meeting with the kind of efficient professionalism that kept military operations running smoothly despite their inherent complexity. The agenda covered upcoming exercises, resource allocation, and personnel assignments for the next several weeks. "We have a major training evolution scheduled to begin Monday," Hayes announced, consulting a thick folder of operational documents. "Base-wide combat readiness exercise designation Trident Strike. All units will be participating in a scenario designed to test our response to a coordinated enemy infiltration of this facility." Sarah listened carefully as Hayes outlined the basic structure of the exercise. Personnel would be divided into defending and attacking forces, with the attackers given specific objectives to accomplish within a set time limit. The defenders would be responsible for protecting critical facilities and preventing the attacking force from achieving their goals. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Hayes said, looking directly at her across the table. You'll be assigned to lead a mixed defensive team responsible for protecting the primary communications facility. It's considered a high-value target, so you can expect concentrated attention from the opposing force. Sarah nodded acknowledgement, already beginning to analyze the tactical challenges the assignment would present. Personnel allocation, sir. You'll have 7 people total, including yourself. Mix of experience levels, which is intentional. We want to see how well integrated teams perform under pressure. Hayes consulted his notes. 2 senior petty officers, 3 junior enlisted, and 2 recruits who specifically requested assignment to your unit. The mention of recruits who had requested her unit was interesting. Sarah wondered if one of them might be Palmer, the red-haired young man who had shown enough sense to back down during the mess hall confrontation. She had noticed him observing her training sessions from a distance over the past few weeks, though he hadn't approached her directly. Rules of engagement, she asked. Standard exercise protocols. Laser tag equipment for weapons simulation, referees to adjudicate casualties and equipment damage. Safety is paramount, but we want realistic stress levels. Hayes looked around the table. Any questions about the basic framework? There were a few clarifications about logistics and communication procedures, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for a large-scale training exercise. As the meeting broke up, Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave, already thinking about defensive strategies for the communications facility. She was almost to the door when Captain Hayes called her back. Lieutenant, a word in private. Sarah returned to her seat as the room emptied, wondering what additional information Hayes wanted to share that couldn't be discussed in front of the group. When they were alone, his demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less formal and more personal. I want you to be aware that there are some complexities surrounding this exercise that didn't seem appropriate to discuss in the general briefing, Hayes said carefully. Nothing that changes your basic mission, but background information that might be useful. Sarah waited for him to continue, sensing that whatever he was about to tell her was significant. There's been some discussion among senior personnel about using this exercise as an opportunity to evaluate integration protocols under realistic stress conditions. Hayes continued, your performance will be closely observed and documented, with results potentially influencing future policy decisions about women in special operations roles. And that wasn't particularly surprising. Sarah had assumed that everything she did at Coronado was being evaluated in terms of its broader implications. Understood, sir. What you might not realize is that there are different opinions about what the results of that evaluation should be. Hayes said, his voice carrying a warning that made Sarah pay closer attention. Some people are hoping you'll succeed spectacularly and prove that integration can work seamlessly. Others are equally committed to seeing you fail, preferably in a way that supports their position that this whole program is premature. Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly. Are you telling me the exercise is compromised, sir? Hayes was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words very carefully. I'm telling you to be prepared for anything. The attacking force will be operating under standard exercise protocols, but that doesn't mean everyone participating has the same investment in fair play and objective evaluation. He stood up and moved to the window, looking out over the training facilities, where personnel were already beginning preparations for the upcoming exercise. You've handled yourself well since arriving here, Lieutenant. The mess hall incident demonstrated that you're capable of dealing with direct confrontation. But this exercise might present challenges that are more subtle and potentially more dangerous. Sarah joined him at the window, following his gaze to the bustling activity outside. What kind of challenges specifically? The kind that are difficult to document or prove after the fact, Hayes replied. Equipment failures that look like accidents, communication problems that could be attributed to normal exercise friction. Situations where proving intentional interference would be nearly impossible, but the cumulative effect would be to undermine your unit's performance. The conversation was moving into territory that made Sarah uncomfortable, not because she was afraid of what Hayes was describing, but because it suggested a level of institutional dysfunction that was troubling to contemplate. Sir, are you advising me to file a preemptive complaint or request different assignment parameters? Hayes turned back to face her, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. I'm advising you to be Sarah Mitchell, the Navy SEAL who earned her place through exceptional performance under pressure. Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember that your mission is to protect that communications facility regardless of what else might be happening around you. That afternoon, Sarah conducted a reconnaissance of the communications facility she would be defending during the exercise. It was a two-story concrete structure located near the center of the base housing equipment that would be critical to coordinating defensive operations during a real emergency. The building had multiple entry points, several vulnerability areas that would require constant observation, and a layout that would present significant challenges for a small defensive force. Sarah spent 2 hours examining every room corridor and potential fighting position, developing mental maps that would be essential when the exercise began. As she completed her survey, Sarah noticed a familiar figure approaching the building. Master Chief Davidson was walking toward her with the purposeful stride of someone who had something important to discuss. "Afternoon, Lieutenant," Davidson said as he reached the entrance to the communications facility. "Heard you drew the high-value target for Monday's festivities." "That's correct, Master Chief. Just finished my initial reconnaissance." Davidson nodded approvingly. "Good. Never go into a fight without knowing your ground." He paused, studying the building with the experienced eye of someone who had conducted similar evaluations countless times. "Mind if I offer some observations?" "I'd welcome them, Master Chief." "This facility has good bones for defense, but it's got vulnerabilities that a smart attacking force will try to exploit," Davidson said, pointing to various features as he spoke. "Multiple entry points mean you'll need to maintain all-around security, but you don't have enough personnel to cover everything simultaneously. You'll need to create overlapping fields of fire and establish fallback positions that allow you to maintain control even if your perimeter is breached." Sarah listened carefully, appreciating the tactical insights from someone with decades of combat and training experience. "Any specific recommendations?" "Mobile defense," Davidson replied immediately. "Don't try to hold fixed positions that can be bypassed or overwhelmed. Use the building's layout to channel attackers into areas where you have advantages, then be ready to move before they can bring superior numbers to bear against you." They spent the next 20 minutes discussing defensive tactics with Davidson, sharing lessons learned from actual combat operations as well as training exercises. His knowledge was encyclopedic, and his ability to explain complex tactical concepts in clear, practical terms reminded Sarah why senior enlisted personnel were considered the backbone of military operations. As their conversation wound down, Davidson's expression grew more serious. "Lieutenant, there's something else you should know about Monday's exercise. Something that didn't get mentioned in the official briefings." Sarah waited for him to continue, sensing that he was about to share information that could be significant. "Word is that some of the personnel assigned to the attacking force have personal investments in seeing this exercise go in a particular way," Davidson said carefully. "Nothing I can prove, understand. Just observations based on 30 years of watching how military politics work when people feel threatened by change." "Are you referring to specific individuals?" "Master Chief?" Davidson was quiet for a moment, apparently considering how much he should say. "Morrison and Thompson, the two recruits from your mess hall education session, somehow managed to get themselves assigned to the attacking force. That could be coincidence, but it could also be something else entirely." Sarah felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. The sabotage campaign she had been experiencing was about to escalate to a new level, with the exercise providing perfect cover for actions that would be difficult to distinguish from legitimate training activities. "What's your assessment of the threat level, Master Chief?" "High enough that you need to be prepared for anything," Davidson replied bluntly. "These exercises create opportunities for people to act on grudges while maintaining plausible deniability. If someone wanted to arrange an accident or create a situation that made you look incompetent, this would be an ideal environment." That evening, Sarah received confirmation that her suspicions about the upcoming exercise were well-founded. While reviewing personnel assignments in her quarters, she noticed several names on the attacking force roster that created a concerning pattern. Morrison and Thompson were indeed assigned to the opposing team, along with several other personnel who had been present during the mess hall incident or whom she had observed making negative comments about her presence at Coronado. More troubling, the attacking force included several senior enlisted personnel who had access to advanced training in unconventional warfare tactics. The coincidence was too convenient to be accidental. Someone with sufficient authority had deliberately arranged for her most vocal critics to be placed in positions where they could directly oppose her during an exercise that would be carefully evaluated by senior leadership. Sarah spent the evening developing contingency plans that went far beyond standard defensive tactics. If the attacking force was planning to operate outside normal exercise parameters, she needed to be prepared to respond with appropriate measures while maintaining the appearance of following standard protocols. She also began preparing documentation that would establish a clear record of events as they unfolded. If the exercise was going to be used as ammunition in the broader political battle over integration, she wanted to ensure that the evidence would support her version of events rather than any narrative her opponents might try to construct. As she reviewed her notes and checked her equipment one final time before turning in, Sarah reflected on the strange position she found herself occupying. She had joined the Navy to serve her country and test herself against the highest standards the military could provide. Instead, she was discovering that the most dangerous enemies she faced might be wearing the same uniform she wore. The thought was sobering, but it didn't shake her determination. She had overcome every challenge thrown at her, so far from Hell Week to the mess hall confrontation. Monday's exercise would be just another test, albeit one with higher stakes and more complex rules of engagement. The next morning brought news that confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions about what was being planned. Palmer, the red-haired recruit who had wisely backed down from the mess hall confrontation, approached her after morning physical training with information that changed everything. Lieutenant, Palmer said, looking around nervously to ensure they weren't being overheard. I need to tell you something about the exercise on Monday. Something you're not going to hear through official channels. Sarah studied his face, noting the genuine concern and internal conflict visible in his expression. What's on your mind, Palmer? Morrison and Thompson have been planning something, Palmer said, his voice barely above a whisper. They've been meeting with some of the senior enlisted guys talking about using the exercise to prove that integration doesn't work. They think if they can make you look bad in front of the evaluation team, it'll set back the whole program. The confirmation wasn't surprising, but hearing it directly from someone who had been close to the situation made the threat more immediate and concrete. Do you have specific information about what they're planning? Palmer shook his head. Nothing detailed, but I heard enough to know they're not planning to play by the rules. They keep talking about creating a situation that proves women can't handle the pressure of real combat operations. Sarah considered the implications of what Palmer was telling her. If Morrison and his allies were planning to operate outside exercise parameters, they were taking enormous risks with their own careers. That suggested a level of commitment to their cause that made them potentially very dangerous. Why are you telling me this, Palmer? The young recruit was quiet for a moment, apparently struggling with the complexity of his motivations. Because what happened in the mess hall changed how I think about some things, he said finally. I realized I was making judgments based on assumptions that weren't supported by evidence. You proved you belonged there through demonstrated competence, and that's something I respect. Sarah nodded, appreciating both his honesty and his courage in coming forward with information that put him at risk within his peer group. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Is there anything else you think I should know? Just that you should be ready for anything on Monday. Morrison's been saying that this exercise is going to settle the integration question once and for all. Palmer paused, then added quietly, he's also been saying that if the official evaluation doesn't go the way it should, there might be other ways to address the problem. The veiled threat in Morrison's words was clear enough, and it raised the stakes for Monday's exercise beyond simple professional evaluation. Sarah was beginning to realize that she might be facing the kind of situation where her survival would depend on skills that went well beyond standard military training. That afternoon, while conducting final preparations for the exercise, Sarah was approached by Captain Hayes with news that added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Lieutenant, there's been a change in the evaluation protocols for Monday's exercise. Hayes said, his expression suggesting that the change wasn't necessarily positive. We'll have external observers from Navy Special Warfare Command, along with representatives from the Pentagon, who are monitoring integration progress across all services. The presence of high-level observers meant that the exercise would receive scrutiny from people with the authority to make policy decisions affecting the entire special operations community. Success or failure wouldn't just impact Sarah's career. It could influence the future of women in combat roles throughout the military. Any changes to mission parameters, sir? None to your basic defensive assignment, Hayes replied, but be aware that every aspect of your performance will be documented and analyzed by people who have strong opinions about how this program should proceed. As Hayes turned to leave, he paused and looked back at Sarah with an expression that carried both encouragement and warning. Remember, Lieutenant, your job is to defend that communications facility and protect your team. Everything else is secondary to mission accomplishment. The message was clear: focus on the tactical objectives and let the political implications take care of themselves. It was good advice, but Sarah knew that the political dimensions of Monday's exercise couldn't be completely separated from the tactical challenges she would face. Sunday evening found Sarah conducting final equipment checks and reviewing her defensive plans one more time. Her team would include Palmer, who had requested assignment to her unit after their conversation about Morrison's intentions. She would also have two experienced petty officers whose competence and reliability were well established, along with three junior enlisted personnel who represented the kind of mixed experience level common in real-world operations. The communications facility itself was as ready as she could make it. Sarah had identified primary and alternate defensive positions, established fields of fire that would allow her team to cover all likely approaches, and develop contingency plans for various scenarios the attacking force might employ. More importantly, she had prepared her team for the possibility that Monday's exercise might not follow standard protocols. Without revealing Palmer's specific warnings or making direct accusations, she had emphasized the importance of maintaining situational awareness and being ready to adapt to unexpected developments. As she settled into her rack for what would probably be a restless night's sleep, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been focused on completing the final phases of SEAL training, concentrated on proving that she could meet every standard and overcome every challenge placed in her path. Now she was preparing for what could be the most important test of her military career, one that would determine not just her own future, but potentially the future of women in special operations roles throughout the American military. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had earned her place through exceptional performance in training scenarios designed to test individual capabilities under extreme stress. Now she was facing a situation where success would depend on her ability to protect her team and accomplish her mission while simultaneously navigating political dynamics that had nothing to do with military competence. But that was the reality of being a pioneer in any field. Breaking barriers required not just individual excellence, but the ability to succeed while carrying the weight of expectations and assumptions that went far beyond personal achievement. Tomorrow would provide another opportunity to demonstrate that barriers could be broken through competence, determination, and the kind of tactical thinking that turned disadvantages into advantages. Sarah had overcome every challenge thrown at her so far, and she was ready for whatever Monday's exercise would bring. The attacking force could plan whatever they wanted. She would be ready for all of it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp California dawn that made Naval Base Coronado seem almost peaceful, despite the intensity of preparations taking place across the facility. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had been awake since 04:30, conducting final equipment checks and reviewing tactical plans that had occupied her thoughts throughout a largely sleepless night. The base-wide exercise, designated Trident Strike, was scheduled to commence at 0800, giving both attacking and defending forces time to reach their assigned positions in complete last-minute coordination. Sarah's defensive team had assembled at the communications facility an hour before the official start time, allowing her to conduct a final briefing and ensure everyone understood their roles in the upcoming scenario. Palmer stood at attention with the rest of her team, his red hair barely visible beneath his tactical helmet. The young recruit had proven himself during the preparation phase, asking intelligent questions about positioning and demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that suggested he might have real potential for advancement if he continued to develop his skills and judgment. The two senior petty officers, Rodriguez and Jackson, were experienced professionals whose competency Sarah had verified through their service records and direct observation during training exercises. Both men had initially shown skepticism about serving under her command, but their attitudes had shifted after witnessing her tactical knowledge and leadership capabilities during the preparation phase. The three junior enlisted personnel rounded out her team: Thompson, Williams, and Foster. All were in their early 20s with varying levels of experience, but enough basic training to function effectively if properly led and positioned. Sarah had spent considerable time over the past few days ensuring that each team member understood not just their individual responsibilities, but how their actions would integrate with the overall defensive strategy. "Listen up," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the pre-dawn quiet of the communications facility. "We have what appears to be a straightforward defensive mission, but I want everyone to understand that this exercise is being closely observed by senior leadership from multiple commands. Our performance here will be documented and analyzed, so I expect nothing less than your absolute best effort." She paused, studying the faces of her team members. More importantly, intelligence suggests that the attacking force may not limit themselves to standard exercise protocols. We need to be prepared for scenarios that go beyond typical training parameters while maintaining our focus on the primary mission of protecting this facility. Rodriguez, the more senior of her two petty officers, raised his hand. "Lieutenant, are you saying we should expect the opposition to cheat?" Sarah considered her response carefully. She couldn't make direct accusations without evidence, but her team needed to understand that they might face challenges that weren't covered in the standard exercise manual. "I'm saying that when the stakes are high and people have strong opinions about the outcome, sometimes the lines between acceptable and unacceptable behavior become blurred. Our job is to accomplish our mission regardless of what tactics the opposing force chooses to employ." The facility itself was as ready as Sarah could make it. She had positioned her team to create overlapping fields of fire that would force any attacking force into predictable movement patterns while maintaining the flexibility to respond to multiple simultaneous approaches. Fallback positions had been prepared that would allow her team to continue defending even if their primary perimeter was breached. Communication equipment had been tested and retested, with backup systems prepared in case of equipment failure or jamming attempts. Emergency procedures had been rehearsed until every team member could execute them automatically under stress. Most importantly, Sarah had developed contingency plans for scenarios that went well beyond standard exercise parameters. At exactly 0800, the exercise officially commenced. Sarah's team took their positions with the practiced efficiency of professionals who understood that training exercises were serious business regardless of their artificial nature. The laser tag equipment that would simulate weapons fire had been calibrated and tested, and referees were positioned throughout the area to adjudicate casualties and equipment damage. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to normal exercise protocols. The attacking force conducted reconnaissance of the facility and surrounding area, probing for weaknesses in the defensive perimeter without committing to direct assault. Sarah observed their movements through carefully positioned observation posts, noting their tactics and trying to identify patterns that would reveal their intended strategy. What she saw was professional and competent, but not exceptional. The attacking force was following textbook approaches to assaulting a defended position, which suggested they either lacked imagination or were deliberately concealing their real intentions until later in the exercise. "Contact front," Rodriguez reported over the communication system. 6 personnel moving toward the main entrance. Standard tactical formation, weapons at ready. Sarah acknowledged the report and shifted to an observation position that allowed her to assess the developing situation directly. The approaching attackers were indeed following standard procedures, advancing by fire and movement in a way that any competent military unit would employ against a defended position. But something about their approach felt wrong. The tactics were correct, but the timing and positioning suggested that this was either a probing attack designed to gather intelligence or a deliberate diversion meant to draw attention away from the real assault that would come from another direction. "All positions maintain awareness of your sectors," Sarah transmitted to her team. "This looks like a diversion. Be ready for simultaneous contact from multiple directions." Her assessment proved correct. Within minutes, Palmer reported movement near the rear entrance, while Jackson observed personnel attempting to approach the facility from the eastern flank. The attacking force was conducting a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously, which represented sound tactical doctrine, but also stretched Sarah's defensive resources to their limit. "Engage targets to your front," Sarah ordered. "Maintain discipline and conserve ammunition. Make every shot count." The simulated gunfire that followed was intense but controlled. Sarah's team had trained extensively on marksmanship and fire discipline, and their performance under the stress of the exercise demonstrated the value of that preparation. The attacking force found themselves facing coordinated defensive fire that forced them to seek cover and reconsider their approach. For 20 minutes, the engagement had continued at a steady pace with both sides maneuvering for advantage, while the exercise referees monitored compliance with safety protocols and rules of engagement. Sarah was beginning to feel confident that her defensive strategy was proving effective when the first sign of trouble appeared. "Lieutenant, I'm getting intermittent communication problems," Jackson reported. "Signal keeps cutting out and I'm hearing what sounds like jamming on some frequencies." Communication jamming wasn't part of the standard exercise scenario, but it could have been added as an additional complication to test defensive adaptability under degraded conditions. Sarah made a mental note to follow up on the source of the jamming after the exercise, but for now she focused on maintaining command and control through alternative methods. "Switch to backup frequencies and use runners if necessary," she ordered. "Don't let communication problems degrade our coordination." The attacking force seemed to recognize that the defenders were experiencing communication difficulties because their tactics immediately became more aggressive and sophisticated. Instead of the straightforward assault they had been conducting, they began employing advanced techniques that suggested the involvement of personnel with specialized training. Sarah watched through her observation scope as the attackers executed a complex flanking maneuver that required precise timing and coordination between multiple elements. This wasn't the kind of tactic that basic infantry would normally employ, which meant the attacking force included people with advanced tactical training. More troubling was the realization that the attackers seemed to know exactly where her defensive positions were located, despite the care Sarah had taken to conceal them during the preparation phase. They were avoiding areas where her team had strong fields of fire and concentrating their efforts on approaches that offered the best chance of success. "They're moving like they have detailed intelligence on our positions," Rodriguez observed over the communication system. "Either they've got exceptional reconnaissance capabilities, or someone provided them with information they shouldn't have." Sarah was beginning to reach the same conclusion. The attacking force was operating with a level of tactical knowledge that suggested they had received detailed briefings on her defensive plans, possibly from someone with access to information that should have been secure. The situation became more concerning when Palmer reported that he was observing attackers using equipment that wasn't part of the standard exercise inventory. "Lieutenant, I'm seeing what looks like night vision devices and possibly thermal imaging equipment. That's not supposed to be available for this exercise." The use of unauthorized equipment represented a clear violation of exercise protocols, but proving it would require documentation that might be difficult to obtain during the heat of ongoing operations. Sarah made the decision to continue defending according to her original plan while carefully documenting any rule violations she observed. "Continue mission," she ordered her team. "Document everything you see that doesn't match exercise parameters, but don't let it distract you from defending this facility." The next phase of the attack revealed just how far the opposing force was willing to go to achieve their objectives. Instead of continuing with the coordinated assault they had been conducting, they began employing tactics that crossed the line from aggressive training into potentially dangerous harassment. Sarah watched in growing alarm as several members of the attacking force approached the communications facility using routes that would normally be considered off-limits due to safety concerns. They were moving through areas that contained hazardous equipment and infrastructure, apparently willing to accept significant risks in order to achieve tactical surprise. More seriously, some of the attackers were using the exercise as cover for actions that went well beyond simulated combat. Sarah observed Morrison directing two other personnel in what appeared to be an attempt to actually damage communication equipment rather than simply capturing it according to exercise protocols. "They're trying to cause real equipment damage," she transmitted to her team. "This is no longer a standard training exercise. Switch to defensive procedures for actual facility protection." The realization that she was facing what amounted to sabotage disguised as a training exercise forced Sarah to make a fundamental shift in her approach. Instead of playing by exercise rules that her opponents had abandoned, she needed to treat this as a real security situation while maintaining the appearance of conducting a training scenario. Sarah's SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this kind of complex situation, where the mission parameters were ambiguous, but the stakes were unmistakably real. She began implementing tactics that went well beyond what would normally be employed in a training exercise, using her knowledge of the facility and her team's capabilities to maximum advantage. Palmer Rodriguez, maintain current positions and continue engaging targets to your front, she ordered. Jackson Williams, Thompson Foster, establish secondary defensive perimeter around critical equipment. I'm going mobile. The decision to abandon the static defensive positions and transition to active countermeasures represented a significant escalation, but Sarah had concluded that the attacking force had already crossed that threshold. If Morrison and his allies wanted to treat this exercise as something more than training, she was prepared to accommodate them. Sarah exited the communications facility through a concealed position that the attacking force hadn't identified during their reconnaissance. Her movement was silent and purposeful, utilizing infiltration techniques that were among the most advanced skills taught in SEAL training. Within minutes, she had positioned herself behind the attacking force with a clear view of their command and control element. What she observed confirmed her worst suspicions about the true nature of what was taking place. Morrison was indeed directing operations that went well beyond exercise parameters, coordinating actions that were designed to cause real damage to equipment and potentially create dangerous situations for defensive personnel. More importantly, she could see that Morrison's team included personnel who weren't supposed to be participating in the exercise at all. Senior enlisted personnel who should have been serving as referees or observers were actively supporting the attacking force with intelligence and tactical guidance. The corruption of the exercise was more extensive than Sarah had realized, involving multiple people in positions of authority who were using their access and knowledge to ensure that her defensive efforts would fail regardless of her tactical competence. But Sarah hadn't survived SEAL training by accepting defeat when faced with overwhelming odds. Instead, she had learned to turn disadvantages into advantages, using superior training and tactical thinking to overcome numerical and resource disparities. She began implementing a strategy that would systematically neutralize the attacking force while documenting their rule violations for later investigation. Her approach would be methodical, professional, and utterly devastating in its effectiveness. Sarah's first objective was to eliminate the attacking force's communication and coordination capabilities. Moving with the silent precision that was the hallmark of advanced special operations training, she approached the position where Morrison had established his command post. The three attackers manning the position were focused on coordinating the assault against the communications facility and didn't detect her approach until she was close enough to engage. Using non-lethal restraint techniques that left them conscious but completely unable to participate further in the exercise, Sarah systematically removed Morrison's command element from the operation. Alpha command element neutralized, she transmitted to her defensive team using codes that wouldn't be understood by the attacking force, initiating mobile counter operations. The psychological effect of her transmission was immediate. The attacking force had expected to face a static defensive position that could be overwhelmed through superior numbers and aggressive tactics. Instead, they found themselves dealing with a predator who was systematically hunting them, using techniques they weren't prepared to counter. Sarah's next target was the group attempting to damage communication equipment inside the facility. She approached their position using infiltration routes that took advantage of the building's architecture and her intimate knowledge of its layout. The attackers were so focused on their sabotage efforts that they never realized they were being stalked until it was too late. Within 15 minutes, Sarah had neutralized 4 more members of the attacking force using techniques that left them secured but unharmed. Each engagement was a textbook demonstration of how superior training and tactical knowledge could overcome numerical disadvantages. More importantly, each engagement was being documented by exercise referees who were finally recognizing that what they were observing went far beyond normal training activities. The systematic precision with which Sarah was dismantling the attacking force was creating an undeniable record of the tactical capabilities that had earned her place in the Navy's most elite unit. "This is incredible," she heard one of the referees say to another as she moved past their position. "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of observing training exercises. She's operating at a level that most of our people never reach." The remaining members of the attacking force were beginning to realize that their carefully planned operation had been turned against them. Instead of conducting a coordinated assault on a fixed defensive position, They found themselves being hunted by someone who possessed skills and knowledge that far exceeded their own capabilities. Thompson, one of the original mess hall antagonists, made the mistake of attempting to engage Sarah directly when he realized she was systematically neutralizing his teammates. The encounter lasted approximately 10 seconds and ended with Thompson secured and effectively removed from the exercise, while Sarah continued her methodical dismantling of the attacking force. "How is she doing this?" Sarah heard Morrison ask one of his remaining teammates, his voice carrying a note of desperation that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. "She's not supposed to be this good," came the reply. "Intelligence said she was just a publicity stunt, someone who got through training on lowered standards. This is something else entirely." The conversation confirmed what Sarah had suspected about the motivations behind the corrupted exercise. Someone in a position of authority had deliberately provided false information about her capabilities in order to encourage Morrison and his allies to attempt something that they would never have tried if they had understood what they were actually facing. But now it was too late for second thoughts or tactical adjustments. Sarah had committed to demonstrating exactly what a Navy SEAL was capable of accomplishing when properly motivated, and she intended to complete that demonstration in a way that would settle all questions about her qualifications and capabilities. The final phase of her counter-operation was the most challenging, requiring her to neutralize Morrison himself, while ensuring that the evidence of his rule violations was preserved for later investigation. Morrison had positioned himself in a location that offered good defensive advantages, but also limited his escape routes, apparently confident that his numerical superiority would be sufficient to achieve his objectives. Sarah approached Morrison's position using techniques that combined stealth infiltration with psychological warfare. Instead of attacking directly, she began systematically removing his remaining support personnel, allowing him to observe each neutralization while being powerless to prevent it. "Your operation is falling apart, Morrison," she transmitted on a frequency she knew he would be monitoring. "You have two choices: surrender now and face whatever administrative consequences await you, or continue this charade until I'm forced to demonstrate exactly why you should have done your homework before challenging a Navy SEAL." Morrison's response revealed both his desperation and his continuing failure to understand the situation he had created. "This isn't over, Mitchell. Even if you win this exercise, you'll never belong here. There are too many of us who understand what's really at stake." "You're absolutely right about one thing," Sarah replied, beginning her final approach to Morrison's position. "This exercise will definitely settle the question of what's really at stake, but I don't think the outcome is going to be what you expected." The confrontation that followed was brief and decisive. Morrison attempted to use his size and strength advantages to overpower Sarah in close combat, and apparently believing that his basic military training would be sufficient against someone he still viewed as an unqualified interloper. He discovered very quickly that his assumptions were catastrophically incorrect. Sarah's hand-to-hand combat skills had been honed through 2 years of the most demanding training the military could provide, and she applied those skills with the kind of professional precision that left no doubt about the outcome. Within 30 seconds, Morrison was secured and effectively neutralized, his exercise weapon removed and his ability to continue participation completely eliminated. More importantly, the entire sequence had been observed and documented by multiple referees who would be able to provide detailed testimony about what had actually occurred during the exercise. Final attacking force element neutralized. Sarah transmitted to the exercise control team. Communications facilities secure, all defensive objectives accomplished. Ready for after-action review and damage assessment. The aftermath of the exercise revealed the extent to which Morrison and his allies had violated both safety protocols and basic military standards. The unauthorized equipment they had employed, the deliberate damage they had attempted to cause, and the corruption of exercise procedures they had orchestrated represented serious breaches of conduct that would require formal investigation. More importantly, the demonstration of Sarah's tactical capabilities had been so complete and undeniable that it effectively ended any reasonable debate about her qualifications and right to serve in special operations roles. The referees' reports would provide detailed documentation of performance levels that exceeded what most military personnel could achieve even under ideal conditions. Captain Hayes approached Sarah as she completed her final equipment checks and prepared to depart the communications facility. His expression combined professional respect with something that might have been awe. "Lieutenant, I've been observing military training exercises for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what you accomplished here today," Hayes said. "The after-action reports are going to make very interesting reading for the evaluation team." Sarah maintained military bearing while internally savoring the satisfaction of a mission accomplished under extremely challenging conditions. "Just doing my job, sir, protecting the facility and my team while accomplishing the assigned objectives." "I think we both know it was considerably more than that," Hayes replied. "You turned what was intended to be a demonstration of failure into a textbook example of how superior training and tactical thinking can overcome any disadvantage." As Sarah walked away from the communications facility, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been focused on completing SEAL training and proving her individual capabilities. Now she had demonstrated those capabilities in a way that would influence military policy and career opportunities for women throughout the special operations community. The 3 recruits who had cornered her in the mess hall had inadvertently begun a process that culminated in the most comprehensive demonstration of special operations capabilities that Naval Base Coronado had ever witnessed. Morrison Thompson and their allies had provided her with the perfect opportunity to prove beyond any doubt that barriers could be broken through competence, determination, and the kind of tactical excellence that transcended any considerations of gender or tradition. But more than that, Sarah had discovered that being a pioneer meant more than just proving individual capability. It meant being ready for whatever challenges arose, whether they came from obvious opponents or from within the institution she had sworn to serve. The exercises at Coronado had taught her that excellence was not just about meeting standards, but about exceeding them so completely that doubt became impossible. As she submitted her final reports and prepared for whatever assignments would follow, Sarah knew that her time at Coronado had accomplished everything she could have hoped for and more. She had earned not just acceptance but respect based on demonstrated performance that spoke for itself. The message was clear to anyone with eyes to see. Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she belonged, and she was ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood on the deck of a classified vessel in waters that didn't appear on any civilian maps, reviewing mission briefings that would have been unthinkable for someone of her gender just a year earlier. The assignment had come directly from Navy Special Warfare Command with a notation that her selection was based on exceptional performance under adverse conditions during training evaluations at Naval Base Coronado. The Trident Strike exercise had become legend within the special operations community. Morrison and Thompson had faced courts-martial for their violations of exercise protocols and deliberate equipment sabotage. More importantly, the detailed documentation of Sarah's tactical performance had been distributed throughout Navy Special Warfare as a case study in adaptive leadership under pressure. Palmer had earned his place in Officer Candidate School, his recommendation letter, signed by Master Chief Davidson with a note that read, "This young man learned to recognize excellence when he saw it, regardless of his preconceptions." The red-haired recruit had requested assignment to Sarah's new unit upon graduation. Captain Hayes had been promoted and transferred to a position where he could influence integration policies across all Navy Special Operations units. His final report on the Coronado training program had been unambiguous. Lieutenant Mitchell represents the standard all future candidates should aspire to meet regardless of gender. Most significantly, Master Chief Davidson had submitted his retirement papers with a final evaluation that entered Sarah into the permanent record of Naval Base Coronado. "In 30 years of evaluating warriors, I have seldom witnessed tactical excellence of this caliber. Lieutenant Mitchell has proven that barriers exist only in minds unwilling to accept demonstrated competence." 3 recruits had cornered her in a mess hall, questioning her right to wear the uniform. 45 seconds later, they learned she was a SEAL. But the lesson that followed over the subsequent months had taught them something far more important: that excellence once demonstrated becomes undeniable. Sarah Mitchell had earned her place not through politics or publicity, but through the same currency the military had always respected: superior performance when it mattered most. The barriers were broken, and there would be no going back.